The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it the sting of sand and the promise of another harsh winter. Sarah McKenzie stood at the frost-covered window of her small log cabin, watching the tumbleweeds roll across the barren land like lonely travelers. The year was 1880, and she had been alone for 3 winters now. The cabin, built by her late husband's calloused hands, groaned under the assault of the November gale. Each creak of the timber reminded her of Thomas's voice, steady, reassuring, telling her the walls would hold against any storm. But Thomas was gone, buried beneath a wooden cross on the hill overlooking their land. The Apache raid that took him had left Sarah with nothing but memories and 40 stubborn acres that refused to yield to her efforts. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the worn wool doing little against the cold that slipped through every crack. At 42, she looked older, her once auburn hair streaked with gray, her face lined by years of hardship and grief. On the mantel sat a photograph, Thomas in his Sunday best, their daughter Emma sitting proudly beside him. The image had faded, but not the pain. Scarlet fever had taken Emma 2 years after that picture was taken, leaving Sarah to face the silence of the plains alone. She turned away from the memories and went about her chores. The fire in the potbelly stove burned low, so she fed it 2 precious logs, wood she had cut herself and rationed carefully through the long winter. Supper was a simple meal of beans and cornbread, the same as most nights. The root cellar still held a few potatoes, but she saved those for when the snow made travel impossible. The nearest town, Dry Creek, was a day's ride away, and she only went when necessary. In town, people treated her with quiet pity. The widow McKenzie, they called her, as if her name itself had died with her husband. The men tipped their hats respectfully. The women invited her to church events, which she attended just often enough to avoid gossip. But none of them understood the depth of her solitude. They had families. They had purpose. Sarah had only routine. Feeding the chickens, mending fences, patching the roof, hauling water. Every day was survival, not living. As darkness settled, Sarah lit her kerosene lamp and sat in her rocking chair, mending a tear in her work dress. The needle moved through fabric with practiced rhythm. The coyotes began their nightly song, their cries echoing across the valley. Once, that sound had frightened her. But now it was just another part of life's rhythm, another reminder that she was alive, though barely. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did, to what could have been. If Thomas had lived, maybe they'd have built that bigger house he always dreamed of. If Emma had survived, maybe she'd be married now, with a family of her own. But such thoughts led only to pain. She had learned to keep her mind anchored to the present. Memories were dangerous. They could break a person more than hunger or cold ever could. The wind rose again, rattling the shutters. Sarah checked the door to make sure it was barred. There were still drifters and thieves in these parts, and she knew better than to take chances. Thomas had taught her to shoot, and his old Winchester stood ready in the corner. She had used it to hunt rabbits and coyotes, but never a man. She prayed she never would. Later, she banked the fire and prepared for bed. Her bedroom was plain. A narrow bed, a dresser, and another picture of Thomas on the nightstand. She slipped under the quilt she'd sewn during her first winter alone and stared at the ceiling. The stars shone faintly through the window, and she remembered how Thomas used to name them for her on summer nights. "The heart can only break so many times before it forgets how to feel," she whispered. She no longer dreamed. Dreams were for people who still had something left to lose. Sometime after midnight, the storm came. It struck like a beast unleashed, wind shrieking through the cracks, snow battering the roof. The temperature dropped so fast that frost crept along the inside of the windows. Sarah fed the fire until her last logs were gone, then wrapped herself in every blanket she owned. Hours passed. The wind screamed. Then another sound, a deep, rhythmic pounding at her door. Sarah froze. No one with good intentions would be out in a storm like this. Her hand found the Winchester, her pulse pounding in her throat. The knock came again, weaker this time, followed by what might have been a voice. Low, broken, desperate. "Please, it said, barely audible above the storm. "I'm dying out here." Every instinct told her to ignore it, to let whoever was out there face the cold alone, but she hesitated. The sound of that voice stirred something buried deep, a flicker of compassion she thought long dead. "Who's there?" she called out. No answer, only a faint groan. Sarah lifted the small wooden panel covering the viewing slot and peered out. A man stood in the blinding snow, swaying like a drunk. His hat was gone, his dark hair plastered with ice. Blood stained his coat near the shoulder. He looked ready to collapse. "Step back from the door!" she shouted. The man tried to obey, but stumbled and fell to his knees. Sarah's breath caught. If she left him out there, he'd be dead within minutes. She lowered the rifle slightly and unbarred the door. The wind blasted in, cutting through the warmth like a knife. "Get inside! Quickly!" she commanded. The man staggered through the doorway and fell to the floor. Sarah slammed the door shut and dropped the bar back in place. Snow and cold filled the room, swirling around them like ghosts. He lay there shivering violently, unable to speak. In the lamplight, she saw his face, weathered but not cruel, younger than she'd expected. He tried to lift his head. "The rifle!" he gasped between chattering teeth. "You won't need it. I can't hurt you. I'm too near frozen." Sarah kept the weapon ready but lowered it a little. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jake," he managed. "Jake Thornton," he winced, clutching his shoulder. "Ambushed. Thought I lost them in the storm." Sarah hesitated only a heartbeat longer before kneeling beside him. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice steady now. "We need to get you warm and tend that wound." With effort, she helped him to the fire, his weight heavy against her as she guided him to the chair near the stove. His coat was soaked, his shirt stuck to his skin with dried blood. "Can you remove your shirt?" she asked. He tried, but his fingers were too numb. Sarah, forcing herself past her hesitation, undid the buttons. The sight of his shoulder made her inhale sharply, a deep, ragged gash that still oozed blood. "Knife?" she asked. "Yeah, caught me clean." Sarah fetched her medical supplies and went to work. The wound was bad, but not fatal. As she cleaned it, Jake gritted his teeth and stayed silent. "You're lucky," she said finally. It missed anything vital. "Lucky?" He gave a faint smile through the pain. "Doesn't feel that way." Sarah poured whiskey over the wound. He hissed, but didn't pull away. "Stay with me, Mr. Thornton," she said gently. "The worst is over." When the bleeding stopped, she wrapped the shoulder in clean cloth and gave him broth from the stove. Their fingers brushed as she handed it to him, and the contact sent a strange, unfamiliar warmth through her chest. "You saved my life, Mrs. McKenzie," she said. "Sarah McKenzie." "Well, Mrs. McKenzie," Jake murmured, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, "you've got my thanks. And my word, I'll be gone the moment the storm breaks." Sarah said nothing. She returned to her chair, mending in hand, though her eyes kept straying to the stranger by her fire. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside, for the first time in years, Sarah McKenzie was not alone. The storm raged for 3 days, burying the Wyoming plains in white silence and trapping Sarah and Jake inside the small cabin. By the second morning, the world outside had disappeared entirely. The windows were rimmed with frost, so thick it looked like lace, and the wind screamed as if trying to claw its way through the walls. Sarah woke to find Jake already up, sitting near the stove, feeding the fire with careful movements. His color had returned slightly, though his face was pale and drawn from the pain in his shoulder. "Morning, Mrs. McKenzie," he said quietly. "Didn't want the fire to die out." She pulled her shawl tighter around her, suddenly aware of her hair, her worn dress, her bare feet against the cold floor. "Thank you," she managed. "How's your shoulder?" "Sore," he admitted, "but healing, thanks to you." He hesitated, his gray eyes meeting hers. "About what I said before I passed out, I was half frozen and not thinking clear." Sarah looked away, busying herself with breakfast. "There's no need to explain. You were delirious." Maybe, Jake said softly, but I remember it clear enough. Sarah ignored the remark, pouring water into the kettle. You'll need strength if you're going to recover. Eat what's here and rest. As the day went on, they fell into an uneasy rhythm. Jake insisted on helping with chores, though his shoulder made him wince with every movement. Sarah gave in, allowing him to mend a broken chair leg while she tended to the fire and the animals in the small barn connected to the house. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable, only unfamiliar, like two strangers learning the rhythm of breathing the same air. At midday, she changed his bandage. "You've done this before," he said. "I had to," she replied. "Thomas was always getting hurt. Farming accidents, broken bones, cuts. I learned quick or we wouldn't have lasted a month out here." Jake watched her hands, steady and practiced. "And your husband?" She paused. "Killed in an Apache raid 3 years ago." He nodded, slowly, respectful. "I'm sorry." Sarah didn't answer. She tied off the bandage and turned away to clean her hands, unwilling to let the old grief open again. By the second evening, the storm had begun to ease, though snow still fell in a fine curtain outside. Jake sat by the fire, whittling a small piece of wood with his pocket knife, while Sarah sewed by lamplight. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them. "You've got a strong place here," Jake said after a while. "Built solid. A man can tell when a home was made with love." Sarah's needle stilled. "Thomas built it with his own hands. He wanted a house that could stand through any storm. I suppose it did." Jake's gaze softened. "Must have been a good man." "He was," she said simply. "Steady, honest, quiet. He didn't talk much, but when he did, I listened." "And your daughter?" "Emma." Sarah's voice faltered. "She died of scarlet fever, 7 years old." Jake said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, "You've had to be stronger than most." "Strength has nothing to do with it," Sarah replied. "You just keep breathing because stopping would be easier, and you're too stubborn to stop." Jake gave a faint, understanding smile. "I know that kind of stubborn." Later that night, as she reached for a pot on the high shelf, her hand slipped and she nearly lost her balance. Jake caught her by the arm. For a moment, they stood frozen, close enough for her to feel his warmth through the fabric of his shirt. The air between them seemed to shift, heavy and charged. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Anytime," he said, stepping back slowly, though his eyes lingered on her face longer than they should have. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the frosted window. The storm had passed. The world outside was buried deep under snow, glittering in the light like crushed glass. Sarah stood by the door, her hands resting on the bar that kept it locked. "You'll be wanting to leave soon," she said quietly. Jake looked up from where he sat, lacing his boots. "If the roads were clear, maybe, but that snow's too deep to travel yet. A few more days." Sarah nodded, though something in her chest tightened at his words. "I'll fix breakfast." As she moved about the small kitchen, Jake spoke again. "You said something last night that stuck with me. About being too stubborn to stop breathing. It's just the truth." "Maybe," he said, his voice low, "but surviving isn't the same as living. You ever think about that?" She froze, her hand stilling on the counter. "I stopped thinking about things like that a long time ago." Jake studied her face. "You remind me of myself. Always moving, doing, fixing, trying not to feel too much because it hurts. But you can't live without feeling, Sarah. You just exist." She turned sharply toward him. "And what do you know about it?" Quote, "More than you think." His tone was calm, not defensive. "I've buried friends, family, seen towns burn, seen good people broken by life. I learned to keep my distance, keep moving, easier that way." "Then why are you still here?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Jake's eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. "Because for the first time in a long while, I don't want to keep moving." Silence fell. The only sound was the pop of the fire. Sarah turned back to the stove, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee. By midday, the sun had melted a thin layer of snow from the roof, and water dripped steadily outside. Jake stepped out to check the horses. and Sarah watched him through the window. He moved with the ease of a man used to open spaces and danger, his broad shoulders outlined against the white landscape. When he came back in, stamping snow from his boots, she asked, "You said you were ambushed. By who?" "The Coulson gang," he said grimly. "Outlaws. Been robbing payrolls and cattle drives all through the territory. I was carrying payment from Cheyenne to Laramie. They got the money, but not me. Guess that makes me a loose end. You think they'll come looking?" He shook his head. "Not in this weather, but once the trail's open again, maybe." That night, as the wind died down completely, the two of them shared a quiet supper. Sarah had never realized how different the cabin sounded with another person in it. The way Jake's deep voice filled the silence, the way his laughter made the shadows seem less heavy. When they finished eating, she stood to clear the table, but Jake stopped her with a gentle hand on her wrist. "You've done enough for one night. Sit a while." She hesitated, then sank into her chair by the fire. For a moment, neither spoke. The flames danced across the walls, and the air between them felt charged again, warm and fragile, like something reborn. "You saved my life," Jake said finally. "Most people would have let me freeze." "Most people haven't lost as much as I have," she replied softly. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding born of loneliness, grief, and the faint, dangerous spark of hope. Sarah turned away first, pretending to busy herself with her mending. "You should rest," she said. "Tomorrow, the snow will ease, and you can go your way." Jake leaned back in his chair, his voice low and thoughtful. "Maybe, but I'm starting to think my way might be here." Sarah didn't answer, but her fingers trembled where they held the needle. For the first time in years, her heart beat not just from habit, but because it remembered how to feel. When the snow finally began to melt, Jake packed his few belongings and saddled his horse. The storm had passed, and the world outside gleamed bright and silent under a hard winter sun. Sarah stood on the porch, her shawl drawn tight, watching him prepare to leave. "You've got everything you need?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "More than I came with," he said with a faint smile. He fastened the strap on his saddle and turned toward her. "You've been more than kind, Mrs. McKenzie. I won't forget it. Safe travels, Mr. Thornton." He hesitated, as if waiting for her to say something else, but she only nodded. With a final tip of his hat, he mounted his horse and rode away down the white trail that wound toward the horizon. Sarah stood watching until he disappeared from view, the sound of hoofbeats fading into silence. Then she turned back toward the cabin, the emptiness pressing heavier than before. It was strange, she thought, how quickly a voice could fill a house, and how quickly its absence could make the walls feel hollow again. Days passed. The snow thawed, and the roads opened. Sarah went about her routine as she always had, but everything felt different now. The house seemed too quiet, the nights too long. She found herself pausing at the table where Jake had sat, glancing toward the chair by the fire where his jacket had once hung. Then came the whispers. It started the day she rode into Dry Creek for supplies. She felt it the moment she stepped into Morrison's general store, the hush that followed her, the way eyes turned and then quickly looked away. Mrs. Morrison's polite smile was tight, her tone cool. "Mrs. McKenzie," she said, ringing up the purchase. "Heard you had a guest during the storm." Sarah met her gaze squarely. "A man was freezing to death on my porch. I let him in. I'd do the same again." The other woman pursed her lips. "Of course. Folks just talk, you understand." "I understand plenty," Sarah said. "I also understand gossip says more about the teller than the one it's told about." She left the store with her head high, but her hands trembled as she loaded her wagon. Dry Creek was a small town, and small towns had long memories. That evening she sat by the fire, staring into the flames until the tears came. She hadn't cried since the day Thomas died. But tonight she did, not from guilt, not from shame, but from the deep ache of being judged by people who had never known real loneliness. A knock at the door startled her. She wiped her eyes quickly and reached for the rifle, though her heart recognized the voice that followed. "Sarah, it's Martha Collins," came the call. Sarah opened the door to find Martha, her old friend from town, bundled against the chill. "I thought you could use some company," Martha said gently. Over coffee, Martha got to the point. "They're saying plenty in town. You know how people are. Abigail Hartley's been running her mouth, calling you shameless." Sarah's jaw tightened. A man was dying in the snow. What did they expect me to do? Bar the door and let him freeze? "I know," Martha said, "and so do the sensible folks. But you know how gossip works. A widow's expected to be saint and statue all at once. The moment she shows she's human, they call her wicked." Sarah stared into her cup. "I did what I had to do." Martha nodded slowly. "You did what was right. But Sarah, I think that man stirred something in you. You look different." "Alive? Again?" Sarah gave a humorless laugh. "Alive? Is that what this is?" Quote, "Yes," Martha said softly. "You've been surviving, not living. Maybe it's time you remembered what it feels like to do both." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The cabin walls that had once protected her now felt like a cage. The gossip didn't matter as much as the truth she had been avoiding. Jake had brought warmth back into a heart she thought had frozen for good. Weeks later, a letter arrived. It came by the hand of young Timothy Palmer from town. Sarah almost didn't take it, assuming it was a bill or a church notice. But the handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper worn from travel. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Mrs. McKenzie, I hope this letter finds you well. I've thought often of the days you gave me shelter. I'm working now at Fort Laramie, breaking horses for the Army. Heard from a friend you might be selling your land. If you are, there's a place here that could use a woman like you. The schoolhouse needs a teacher. The town's kinder than most, and they don't much care about past talk, only character. I'm not asking for anything, only saying there's a life here, if you want it. Gratefully, Jake Thornton." Sarah read it 3 times. By the end, her hands were trembling. She went to the mantel and looked at the photograph of Thomas and Emma, then out the window at the land that had cost her so much. That evening, she saddled her horse and rode to the hill where her husband and daughter rested. The setting sun painted the sky gold and crimson. She knelt by their graves, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered, "but I can't keep living like this. I loved you both with everything I had, but I'm still here. And I think I'm meant to be." The wind rustled the dry grass around her, soft and gentle, like a blessing. 2 weeks later, Sarah McKenzie sold her land. People in Dry Creek talked, of course. They said she was running away, that she'd lost her mind, that she was chasing after some cowboy. But Sarah didn't care anymore. She loaded her wagon with only what mattered: her grandmother's china, Thomas's books, Emma's doll, and the carved wooden bird Jake had left behind. When she arrived at Fort Laramie, the air smelled different, sharper, cleaner, full of life and noise. Children ran through the streets. Soldiers called to one another near the fort. And somewhere among them, she knew, was Jake. He was waiting near the stable, wiping down a chestnut mare. When he saw her, his expression was a mixture of surprise and quiet joy. "Mrs. McKenzie," he said softly, removing his hat. "You came." "Sarah," she corrected, smiling for the first time in years. "And yes, I came." Jake's gaze met hers, steady and full of something unspoken but understood. "Welcome home, Sarah." She looked around, the bustling town, the distant hills, the promise of something new, and realized that, for the first time since the world had fallen apart, her heart felt light. The widow thought passion was dead. But on that bright Wyoming morning, as a cowboy smiled at her like dawn itself, Sarah McKenzie knew it had only been waiting to be found again.